In the aftermath of President Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, the world rapidly diverted its commercial alliances in what has become a stark exemplar of a modern trade war. Within 48 hours, the United States found itself excluded from a monumental aluminum agreement struck by Canada and the European Union. This move wasn't a simple trade negotiation, it was a decisive geopolitical rebuke. While Trump was amplifying his America First stance on a Pennsylvania stage, insisting tariffs would revitalize domestic manufacturing, international partners quietly sought alternative structures. The result, Ottawa and Brussels crafted a multi-billion-dollar aluminum pact, deliberately omitting the US, signaling a shift in economic alignment. Fundamental to this pivot was the recognition of political risk. Allies long reliant on stable supply chains perceived American policy as erratic. The weaponization of tariffs had unintended consequences, triggering a swift reaction. Canada, rather than protesting, leveraged the opportunity to invest in its own aluminum industry, allocating $1.1 billion toward domestic capacity. Concurrently, supply routes were redesigned. Shipments, once bound for Detroit, were rerouted to Brussels and Tokyo. Over 3 million tons of aluminum found new pathways outside US borders. The ramifications were immediate. American manufacturers from Michigan to California confronted skyrocketing raw material prices, up 54% within weeks, and ensuing production challenges. In essence, this episode evolved beyond a trade dispute into a credibility crisis. The very nature of a trade war is to compel bilateral pressure, yet this confrontation yielded a different outcome. Instead of compelling partners to yield, it accelerated their exodus, forming new alliances and solidifying the global buy-in for non-US trade corridors. It is a cautionary tale of how aggressive tariff policy can reconfigure the global economic landscape, with America finding itself on the outside looking in. The unfolding events since the steel and aluminum tariffs underscore a hard-earned lesson in international commerce and diplomacy. This trade war, initiated by the Trump administration, was designed as leverage to bring manufacturing back home. Yet, rather than compelling foreign producers to concede, it catalyzed a decisive shift in trade relationships. Canada's response was swift and subtle. While Washington flexed tariffs, Ottawa quietly committed $1.1 billion to modernize its aluminum industry. Infrastructure investments quickly followed, beginning construction on deep water docks and rail connections designed to bypass US territory. Shipping aluminum directly from Quebec to European and Asian markets became not just feasible but financially advantageous. Ultimately, this redirected over 3 million tons of aluminum. Meanwhile, American manufacturers were squeezed. US domestic aluminum prices surged, climbing about 54% in a matter of weeks, directly impacting industries dependent on the metal, automotive, aerospace, defense. Factories paused, procurement officers scrambled, and American contracts unraveled. In one stark instance, an Ohio manufacturer lost a $23 million contract to a German competitor, due in no small part to pre-arranged Canadian supply deals. The trade war rhetoric, tariffs will rebuild industry, bring back jobs, became sharply ironic. Businesses were caught off guard by an unforeseen supply chain realignment. Global buyers reclassified American goods as politically risky, not because of inferior quality, but because of unpredictability. The trust deficit grew deeper with each sudden tariff announcement and each tweet from Washington. Canada, by contrast, projected stability. It didn't retaliate with noise, it acted decisively, investing in clean energy, declaring aluminum a strategic national asset, and enacting measured industrial policy that shielded domestic producers. It wasn't just protectionism, it was strategic industrial sovereignty. As the world watched, the failure of the US to predict or respond effectively to these shifts exposed a key flaw in aggressive trade war tactics. The real power lies in consistency, foresight, and credible commitments, not merely in punitive tariffs. This episode serves as a timely reminder that economic warfare is not won through strength alone, but through strategic discipline and reliable partnership. What made this episode so significant wasn't just the loss of a trade deal, it was the systematic unraveling of America's position in the global supply chain. The trade war, launched under the premise of restoring American manufacturing, ended up doing the opposite. It fragmented existing trade relationships and forced traditional allies to forge new paths. Canada, once reliant on US buyers, pivoted swiftly. Instead of lobbying for exemptions, they rewired their logistics. Rail lines were constructed to move aluminum directly to port cities like Sagin, avoiding US soil entirely. From there, massive cargo ships transported aluminum ingots straight to Europe and Asia. This bypass wasn't symbolic, it was structural. The new routes eliminated customs delays, tariff unpredictability, and political volatility. Three factors that once defined North American trade efficiency. Meanwhile, US companies were thrown into disarray. Without access to tariff-free aluminum, they faced not only higher costs but also delivery uncertainties. Some firms resorted to repurchasing the same Canadian aluminum they had once imported directly now through intermediaries and at inflated prices. This ironic consequence of the trade war, paying more for what used to be cheap and reliable, highlighted the short-sightedness of unilateral tariff strategies. Canada's strength came from its ability to play the long game. They didn't merely respond to tariffs, they used them as a catalyst for industrial reinvention. Aluminum was declared a national strategic asset, and investment followed across the supply chain. Battery production, aerospace hubs, and clean energy initiatives were all aligned to reduce dependency on volatile trade partners. By mid-2025, Canadian exports had surged, with new deals signed across Europe and Asia at pre-tariff pricing. What emerged was a quiet but decisive shift in trade dynamics. Countries like Japan and Germany no longer viewed the US as a stable supply partner. The term trade war became synonymous with volatility. In contrast, Canada was seen as dependable, clean, and forward-looking. They didn't shout, they strategized, and in doing so, they not only absorbed the economic blow, but turned it into global credibility. This part of the trade war saga illustrates how soft power, consistency, trust, and strategic investment can outperform brute force, and how in today's interconnected world, trade isn't just about goods, it's about reputation. America's loss wasn't just in tons of aluminum, it was in global influence. As the trade war unfolded, the domestic implications within the United States grew increasingly severe. What began as a political maneuver to protect American industry became a logistical nightmare for manufacturers, especially in key industrial states like Michigan, Ohio, and Texas. Aluminum, once easily sourced from Canada at stable prices, was now subject to fluctuating tariffs and unreliable delivery schedules. The direct result was production delays, increased costs, and cancelled contracts. Defense contractors in particular faced raw material shortages that threatened the timely completion of aerospace and military projects. The very sector the tariffs were intended to safeguard was instead destabilized by their unintended consequences. In a particularly jarring twist, American companies found themselves unable to compete globally. International clients began to label US suppliers as politically risky, not because of quality issues, but due to the erratic nature of trade policy. The mere possibility of a sudden tariff adjustment or a tweet from the White House could derail entire procurement cycles. This perception of instability became a competitive disadvantage that no amount of pricing adjustments could fix. By contrast, Canada's disciplined approach stood in stark relief. While the US reacted loudly, Canada responded strategically. It introduced targeted subsidies, prioritized green production, and coordinated infrastructure upgrades, all while avoiding public confrontations. The message was clear: while America waged a chaotic trade war, Canada positioned itself as a safe, stable, and forward-thinking partner. Ultimately, the long-term reputational damage may outweigh the economic costs. The United States, once the bedrock of global trade stability, was now being seen as a liability. The trade war didn't just affect contracts or commodity prices, it altered how the world perceived American reliability. And in an era where trust is currency, that perception shift may prove to be the most damaging outcome of all. By mid-2025, the full consequences of the aluminum trade war were visible across nearly every industrial sector in the United States. Assembly lines slowed, procurement teams were overwhelmed, and factory floor operations stalled due to supply chain volatility. These weren't isolated disruptions, they were systemic failures rooted in a miscalculation of how international trade partners would respond to abrupt tariff increases. The Trump administration had hoped that aggressive measures would force countries like Canada to make concessions. Instead, it prompted strategic decoupling. The US was not met with negotiation, it was met with quiet, coordinated exits from supply chains that had been decades in the making. Nowhere was this more evident than in the defense and aerospace industries. Traditionally reliant on high-grade Canadian aluminum, American contractors were now scrambling to find alternate sources. But with the global market responding to US instability, Canada had already locked in new supply contracts with European and Asian partners. That meant American firms had to compete for a shrinking pool of aluminum at inflated prices if they could even secure it. Critical projects for naval vessels and jet fighters were delayed or paused altogether. In the unforgiving world of defense procurement, time lost often translates to strategic disadvantage. Meanwhile, Canada wasn't just supplying raw materials, they were building out entire industrial ecosystems. Battery plants, clean hydrogen hubs, and aerospace centers emerged around aluminum corridors, designed with long-term resilience in mind. Each investment insulated them further from the unpredictability of a US-led trade war. Their government classified aluminum as a strategic asset, guaranteeing demand through defense and green energy programs. This forward-thinking approach didn't just protect Canadian producers, it elevated them as preferred partners in the eyes of global buyers. In economic terms, Canada turned a crisis into a catalyst for modernization. In political terms, it asserted sovereignty over its trade destiny. And in reputational terms, it stepped into a vacuum left by America's unpredictability. The contrast could not have been sharper. While Trump delivered fiery speeches promising industrial revival, Canada executed a multi-tiered strategy that prioritized consistency, foresight, and infrastructure. Perhaps the most ironic consequence of the trade war was that American companies found themselves importing Canadian aluminum through intermediaries at higher prices than they had paid before the tariffs. The very policy that was supposed to make America more self-reliant instead made it more dependent, more exposed, and far less competitive. In essence, the US had initiated a trade war it could not win, not because it lacked economic power, but because it misunderstood the nature of global trade in the 21st century. This was no longer a game of tariffs and retaliation. It had become a contest of trust, coordination, and long-term vision. And in that game, Canada won decisively, not with noise, but with strategy. The aluminum fallout of 2025 offers a sobering lesson in the unintended consequences of economic nationalism. What began as a bold attempt by President Trump to reassert American manufacturing through tariffs quickly spiraled into a geopolitical misstep. The trade war with Canada and the European Union didn't just disrupt commodity flows, it reshaped global trust, redirected decades-old supply chains, and revealed critical vulnerabilities in the US industrial ecosystem. At the heart of this collapse was a fundamental misunderstanding of how global trade operates in the 21st century. Tariffs, once viewed as tactical tools for protection, became symbols of unpredictability. Businesses don't thrive in uncertainty, and neither do governments seeking stable partners. The aluminum sector became ground zero for a broader crisis in confidence. Suppliers and buyers across continents began questioning whether the United States could still be trusted to uphold its trade commitments or maintain policy consistency. Canada, in contrast, recognized that in a trade war, discipline and long-term planning are often more powerful than bravado. Rather than responding with retaliatory measures, Ottawa invested in infrastructure, aligned its policy with industrial goals, and cultivated international partnerships. The quiet efficiency with which Canada executed its strategy allowed it to transform from a secondary aluminum supplier into a central hub for clean, reliable industrial resources. Meanwhile, American manufacturers bore the brunt of tariff-induced chaos. Factories experienced delays, prices soared, and foreign contracts were lost not because of inferior products, but because of the fear of sudden policy reversals. The irony was striking. In seeking to protect American jobs, the administration created a business environment so unstable that even loyal clients looked elsewhere. In this trade war, the real cost wasn't just measured in tons of metal or lost contracts. It was measured in reputational damage, weakened alliances, and strategic losses. Canada's ability to offer certainty, sustainability, and neutrality gave it a unique advantage in a world seeking alternatives to US-centric supply chains. The fact that defense and clean energy sectors now prefer Canadian aluminum isn't just about material quality, it's about trust. The United States, once a beacon of trade stability, has now been reclassified by many partners as a risk. The trade war that was meant to re-establish dominance instead showcased the perils of unilateralism in an interdependent world. And while the economic pain is substantial, the erosion of credibility may be far harder to recover. Looking ahead, the US must reflect on whether it wants to lead the global economy or alienate it. If the lesson of this trade war is to mean anything, it must inspire a shift from reactionary policy to strategic engagement. Because in today's global marketplace, power isn't just about control, it's about cooperation, consistency, and the ability to be counted on when it matters most. The aluminum crisis of 2025 stands as a defining case study in strategic failure and unexpected strategic brilliance. From a long-term perspective, the trade war initiated by the United States was not simply an economic gamble, but a fundamental misread of global interdependence. The Trump administration's tariffs aimed at strengthening domestic industry instead triggered a tectonic shift in how nations align their economic futures. The real strategic error was assuming that allies had no alternatives, that trust could be strained without consequence, and that economic coercion would bring results. In reality, it invited resilience, diversification, and realignment, most notably by Canada. Strategically, Canada's approach was not reactive but visionary. Faced with a volatile partner, Ottawa didn't retaliate with rhetoric or escalatory tariffs. It studied the playing field and responded with a sophisticated game plan: protect domestic producers, stabilize pricing, and present itself as a sanctuary from the chaos of the trade war. This was not just economic survival, it was strategic repositioning. By framing aluminum as a national asset and integrating it into broader clean energy and defense strategies, Canada elevated its role in global trade. The success lay in the interconnectedness of their response. Infrastructure, energy policy, environmental standards, trade diplomacy, and fiscal planning were synchronized into one coherent strategy. While the US sought short-term gains through economic pressure, Canada secured long-term influence through stability and alignment. Countries like Japan, Germany, and Singapore did not just start buying aluminum from Canada, they began rewriting their procurement strategies around Canadian reliability. The US, by contrast, failed to adapt its strategy to the evolving terrain of global commerce. The assumption that a trade war could be won through isolationist tools overlooked the basic principle of today's supply chains. They thrive on predictability. American companies were left without raw materials, defense projects were delayed, and even the branding of Made in the USA lost its edge due to fear